I'm absolutely thrilled to present to you the Azim Premji University Schoolbooks Archive. We have over 4,000 texts available already. These are not just textbooks, but this is curricular material, curricular documents, teaching learning material, assessment of textbooks, and a host of other things. Now, why is that so exciting? Why is that so interesting? The reason is pretty simple. This entire collection ranges back through centuries, literally centuries. We are not talking about the past 50 years, centuries. And if you think of school books through the past centuries and these associated material that I've talked about, that presents to you a historical trajectory of the country in all its aspects in amazing, fascinating detail. Because if you think of school books, what do they reflect? They reflect what a society thinks is important. What should we be teaching our children? What should our children learn? What is good? What is bad? What is not so good, not bad? What are our problems? What are we inspired by? Now you think of that reflected how they are in school books, and you think of that trajectory through the centuries. And that's why this archive is so wonderful, so exciting, so valuable. It's not something that would interest only those of us who are working in school education. It's actually a matter of interest, whether you're a historian, whether you're a sociologist, whether you're an anthropologist, or whether you're just interested in this wonderful country. So come, have a look at this online archive, which is today 4,000 strong and will just keep growing.
So Rashmi, how would you describe the Schoolbooks Archive project? What is it all about?
Okay, I think to start off our conversation, I'll just give you a brief overview of the project. The Schoolbooks Archive project is named that way because we want to be sure that it reaches a niche audience that is involved in the production, the writing, and the use of school-related materials, primarily aimed at those who are also involved in improving the quality of public education. We realize that the felt need requires us to have an international perspective, which is not just look at school-related materials and textbooks that are in active use in India and multiple states across India, but also look at with a very deep focus at what is being taught in our region, which is South Asia. And as we go forward, also bring in practices and resources that relate to the quality of school education in leaders of public education across the world who are recognized as such, for example, Finland. The digital website that we are launching soon houses those materials that within fair use and copyright rules we are able to share through a free open access platform with the general public at large, because we think that the number of people and the types of people for whom this is a key area of concern need not be restricted only to academics working in voluntary organizations, government, or our university.
So why is Azim Premji University creating or working towards creating such an archive? How does it fit with the mandate of the university?
So the Azim Premji Foundation, of which the Azim Premji University is a part, started work in 2001 and has over more than 2 decades now continually engaged with this primary vision of working to improve the quality of school education in the state-run schools to which the majority of Indian children go, even till date. The university was set up in 2011 with its first batch of students entering the university. And right at the start, we in fact began with a Masters in Education program and a Masters in Development program. And both of these, as you know, are a kind of domain-led understanding of what higher education needs to be, rather than a discipline-led one. So the Masters in Education program was our flagship program right at the start of the university and continues to be so. Obviously, after 2011 till today, many more teaching programs are being offered by the Azim Premji University School of Education. both at the undergraduate, postgraduate level, and also through continuing education programs for working professionals in the education sector. So, during the academic year of the Azim Premji University, we have a large number of people who are not only faculty and students that are discussing and debating these issues, but are also experts and government functionaries, academics and scholars who come in for various reasons, seminars and all kinds of knowledge events, right? So workshops and things like that. And we felt that looking at the quality of discussions that happen through all of these sort of scholarly engagements, access to a kind of school books repository, and we don't call them textbooks because we understand that school books is far more than just textbooks. Access to something like this on the campus as well as digitally would greatly enhance the quality of work that we are able to do. Now, having said that, we are obviously not the only sort of archive in the country. We do have two excellent digital libraries, one called the National Digital Library of India, which is maintained by the Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur, and another called Bharatvani, which is maintained by the Central Institute for Indian Languages at Mysore. And there are others, of course, but these two we find are have the kind of similar wanting to make open access digital resources available to the public agenda. Like I said, since this is an archive that has to be collaborative and reach out to a large number of people engaged in many questions related to school education, the repository is designed not just to be a digital version of a physical dump of a library. It is an interactive site, which means that our team annotates the resources that we have with what are called research notes, which draw attention to that particular resource and how it can be leveraged to explore different lines of research. Once again, it's not a one-way street. So we also have space for a discussion thread, which means a user can also then put digitally the ideas on the platform, so that even if you're not possibly physically engaged in a workshop, these kind of discussions can go on online over time. And finally, we also have designed a rating system within the site, so that in a democratic sense, users have a voice in sort of giving us feedback as to what resources they really find very, very useful and what maybe not so much. And that also helps other users to navigate their way into the right kind of resource. We have also taken a lot of trouble to ensure that the search interfaces are very user-friendly. So our documents or our resources are organized into language-based community. India is of course a cauldron of regional languages, and so that itself got us excited because we've got textbooks from all parts of India in so many different languages, and I'm sure as we increase the international focus of our collection, that challenge is going to multiply even more. Having said that, what we try to do is for the user, once you choose the language for the collection you wish to browse, there are multiple tags through which you can search and reach the resource of your interest. So you could search, for instance, by document type. You could search by period over the entire 200 years of our collection. You could search by the state in India where the resource is being used. You could search across countries and states for a particular subject, school level subject like science or history, and a particular grade, right? So these are technical sort of aids to a scholar, so that rather than just be faced with a big dump of material, you can navigate your way according to your interest area. And we are always open to further suggestions to improve user interactivity.
So is this the only archival project that is on at Azim Premji University, or are there other archival projects, and if there are, how does this project complement other archival projects of the university?
We have already started receiving a lot of donated collections, from a variety of scholars. So for instance, and these are only a few examples, the entire collection of David Horsburgh, who is known to be an eminent educationist, the entire collection of Dr. Pushpamitra Bhargav, who is an eminent biologist, the collection of Nandalal Sawhney, an eminent jurist, to just a few that come to my mind, they have been donated to the library with the expectation that we would help to preserve these collections. So the Knowledge Resource Center, which manages not just the library but other knowledge platforms across the foundation, has taken particular care to plan for the physical preservation of some of these donated materials if they are seen to have a kind of archival value where people wish to actually touch and feel and see the material. So for instance, correspondence by these scholars, or some of them have varied interests like stamp collections or paintings which have nothing to do with their scholarly pursuits but gives you a picture of the person as a whole. Now these we are planning to preserve in under archival conditions. The majority of the materials that we feel without always taking care of fair use and copyright regulations can be actually opened out to the public. We would like to go ahead and open it out to the public. The ones that can't are still available in our university library, and we welcome queries by scholars, even regular citizens of India that would wish to come and see these collections to just write to us, and we have a provision for external temporary membership into our library to enable that kind of transactions. The Schoolbooks Archive therefore is part of the idea that as a university we could play a role in preserving repositories of knowledge over time across a variety of disciplines. Like any typical university, we do not only work in education but across disciplines and domain areas like health and sustainability and environment and a bunch of them, water, and within disciplines economics and physics and biology and literature and history and so forth. So this would be a continuing sort of process. We are a transaction-led, active teaching learning community in the university. So the ambition is not to be the National Archives of India. The ambition is only for the kind of subject areas where there's a lot of transaction happening within the university. If there are valuable collections that come to us, we need to do full justice to it. We are not passive. We don't wait for people to come to us and give us their collections. We also actively reach out to people to see whether they would be interested in us helping with the digitization, preservation and sharing of materials that they have accumulated over the years. So we just welcome anyone who feels that they have a store of resources that should be useful to scholars and students and faculty across India to write to us, at which point we visit the premises or look at the list of materials being offered, the quality and how much of preservation is required, and help with the whole process of acquisition and integration into our collection. My vision would be that even obscure collections held in smaller towns that are really facing a threat of extinction, because very often a scholar who collects these, like many of us, just go on buying without thought as to what is going to happen if we should pass away or whatever, or if we should no longer have space to preserve these collections. So we do have the ability to also house regionally and deeply located collections in the libraries that we have in all of these. There are at least about 57 to 60 such teaching learning centers on a current count. So not everything has to be in Bangalore, and not does everyone have to come to Bangalore will engage with these archives. So Professor Vardarajan, as a faculty member and scholar engaged with education for so many years, could you share with us what have been some of your experiences and interactions that led you to feel the need to build the Schoolbooks Archives at our university?
I think there is a story to be told in the way the initial stages led to the idea of an archive. One could go back to early 2014 when Wipro Applying Thought in schools, the organization was about to hold their annual partners meet, and for that particular year they had decided to focus on teaching learning materials in schools as the focal point of discussion among educationists, partner organizations and so on. Now this gave us an opportunity to curate a very small exhibition, and they were very happy to do that, to allow us to hold such an exhibition during the 3-day meet. It was a very small exhibition. We had about 60-70 books, and we could display only about 50. And most of these books that we could display, they were all from the 19th century and a few from the first 2-3 decades of the 20th century. Now, for those who were attending this partners meet, for a good number of them, they had read literature on the history of textbooks, but this was perhaps the first time they were getting to see some of these books, before them, what it looked like, what were the people who were writing, how were they produced, and so on and so forth. So it did generate some interest among those who attended the partners meet. But there were a few individuals who sort of pushed us with a lot of questions. I should mention a couple of names here. One was Professor Jayashree Ramdas, who at that point in time was the director of Homi Bhabha Center for Science Education. And we had very few books in biology at that point in time. And she was asking, okay, what about biology books in other languages in different periods and time, and so on and so forth. So that set us to think that, okay, we need more we need to collect more on this subject from different periods in time, and so that's one aspect. But then there were I think there were 3 books which were all Marathi readers, and they were titled Marathi Reader 1, Marathi Reader 6, Marathi Reader 5, and Marathi Reader 7. Now she began to ask us to find out whether it was possible to trace it all the way back to what would have been the first Marathi reader like, what would have been the 8th or 9th Marathi reader like. So they were trying to tell us that, look, we need, when we are collecting something, we also need to see, okay, what would have been, how they sort of fit in a sequence of books and so on. Okay. Now the point that she was also raising, the question that she was asking us to probe was significant, because those who had already written about textbooks, which educationists were using quite a lot, they remained either very general surveys or using a small set of books for analysis and so on. But given that public education, mass education has a history of 200 years, this had to cover a large variety of materials in different languages, on different subjects and so on. So that already opened up the need to collect more and more. The other person who took enormous interest in what was being displayed there was Arvind Sardana, who was with Eklavya Bhopal till very recently. He had similar questions to ask, but he was also curious to know is there a way in which we can understand the evolution of textbook as we understand today? Was it always like this in all through these 200 years. So, or whether a systematic attempt to collect more and more of these books will help you destabilize the idea that we are so near to us and we think that this is what a textbook should look like. So there were many such questions. But both these individuals also asked us to get in touch with many others who had done substantial amount of work. And that is what led us to speak with Professor T.V. Venkateswaran, Dr. T.V. Venkateswaran, Professor K. Subramaniam, C.N. Subramaniam, Subbu, and they asked us to look at many other sources which would give us some idea about the kind of books that would have been produced. One was the printed catalogues of early 20th century, which the British Museum Library had compiled thick volumes, but they had listed almost every book that had been published in different languages, different subjects and so on. So this is a mine of information that at least gave us an idea as to what are the things that we could look for. Now this is a big leap for us because when we curated this exhibition, we were pretty much relying on what we came across and we had not made a systematic attempt towards looking for things. But these pointers also told us, okay, what were the other things that that we could look for. And they were also and these were the very individuals who told us that, look, many of these most interesting literature on school books, textbooks, whatever you may want to call it at this stage, had also been looked at by scholars working in other areas, for instance, book historians. So they sort of, expanded the universe that we could now navigate and then thereby collect material for us. Now, after this, what is exhibited, but it is important to note that at this point, creating an archive, putting them all together in one place, I don't think we had ever thought of this. It was a matter of collecting, and also because a lot of people were looking for such material, sending them to them, but there were also people who were constantly sending us books. So it remained at that stage. Now, 2 years later, the Contemporary Education Society of India was to have a conference, their annual conference at Azim Premji University in Bangalore. That gave us an opportunity to curate another exhibition, by which time we had more books to display. And there were a lot of younger scholars, doctoral students, teachers, and many, organized representatives from many organizations who took a lot of interest in what was being displayed. And then on, the number of queries for more and more such materials began to increase in large numbers. But they also told us, okay, why are we not looking at, the collection at that till that time was largely historical material, 19th century, early 20th century, and so on. But they also asked us to look at what were textbooks like, in say 1950s, 1960s. You had some idea about what these books, who were the authors, and so on. But we did not have a substantial number in our collection. So we began to look actively for books, say in the post-independence period, and so on. Within a year, we had another exhibition at the Regional Science Museum in Bhopal. So these events got us to speak with a large number of individuals who had been worrying about these issues or were curious to know about them, but they were also trying to tell us that what are the kind of things that we should look at. And it was through these discussions that we began to realize that, textbooks have had a major role to play, but when we are collecting these books, we must not think that textbooks alone or independent entities should be treated as independent entities. They occupy a space within a network of say the forces that determine them, the documents that were produced which will explain why this book was written at this point. So that's what led us to look at, okay, more and more curriculum documents should be collected, more and more teacher education material relating to these books that were being introduced in the schools. How did this get reflected in the teacher education material? What kind of books were being written for teachers who would use this material, or how should they be using this material, and so on and so forth. And these very individuals also told us that one of the ways in which we can get a much better sense of how textbooks were to be used, the kind of discussions that took place on how teachers could be used is to look at teacher magazines that had a very long history. That's an area that we still haven't studied much, or an area that we should look at. So they in fact contained substantial discussions on how books should be written. So all of these discussions led to that. Now we also began to realize that there is with such rich material waiting to be collected, organized and made available, we began to realize how such an attempt would substantially nuance how we understand textbooks. Its long process of evolution as a very idea or a genre, the processes that have also evolved over time, the utter variety that we see, the number of agencies or different types of organizations that have been introduced. So that was an exciting period, the formative period that led us to think that, okay, now we have to get on with the task of creating an archive. So what has it taken to establish an archive for school books?
In 2016, we invited a large set of external to the Azim Premji University, experts who are not part of the university or the foundation community, but are working in multiple capacities, not just on creating textbooks or writing content for textbooks, but also in the broader agenda of leveraging learning resources in actual classrooms, and the whole purpose of all of it, which is to improve the quality of school education. In that consultative sort of workshop, the clear output that we were aiming at was a concept note about, okay, we all get it, what should the Schoolbooks Archive be? And that helped us, and in a sense that is, I think, given us a framework that works for us for at least the next 10 to 20 years. With involvement with people outside of our little bubble of academics in a university. This next step was to actually look at what we have and identify where the gaps are. So for instance, if you're taking a 200-year frame just for India, what would be the critical time periods within which we need to focus our collection building efforts? Who would be the agencies that we can reach out to? And right from the start, it was very clear that no team of even a very large team of librarians, archivists and faculty can really do this on their own. So the approach has to be collaborative, which means you reach out to organizations that are known to have these resources, and also always hope for the incidental scholar who will come in with a gift of materials that you don't expect. So to collection building and an aggressive or a focused approach towards collection building, which has helped us reach where we are, but which is going to be a continuing activity for all of us, because given the vision we have, this is just the first step. The launching of the digital archives is just the first step. This is going to take us several years to really build up to what we have in mind. So making those collaborations outside of the university with multiple agencies, publishers, both government or state and non-state, actual content writers, illustrators, editors. And the most interesting thing that we have already started doing, we hope to do more, is actually have video recordings of how these learning resources are transacted in classrooms, because that gives researchers a segue into seeing the pedagogical aspects. Because at the end of the day, however beautifully designed your teaching learning resources, it gets a life of its own in the classroom, right? So video recordings of discussions that dig deep into what is involved in designing the right kind of learning resource support to the ultimate goal of good learning in classrooms. That's one. Recordings of actual transactions in classrooms where materials are being used. And so there's a variety of, when I say collection building, it's not just, looking for published textbooks and workbooks and examination papers and things like that. There's a variety of documents which you're aware of, and maybe we can talk about it in greater depth. But also actually using the large presence that we have across India through our very dynamic field teams to do the kind of into the classroom picture of what goes on with learning resources. So that I think is a high value add to the archives. The thing that we have learned through doing is navigating the legal, copyright and memorandums of understandings that we've had to write to make sure that in our attempt and our enthusiasm to engage with providing a user-friendly repository of learning resources, we do not overstep the rules of the game that are operative in terms of both the creation and distribution of content. So that's a third area that we need to continuously keep an eye on. And like I said, we for that we of course send out an open sort of letter, email, conversations with multiple agencies, trying to explain what our purpose is here, and that that there is no commercial intent behind this of any kind. Also that we are not really engaged with materials that are in contemporary use and have commercial value, but rather the history of learning resources. And most importantly, when we reach out to all of these people involved in creating this resource content, in a sense, making them up working partners, people who would not just provide us with collections and permissions, but actually tell us and work with us to sort of extend the scope of the archive itself. So while Azim Premji University has launched the Schoolbooks Archives to just get the ball rolling, as we move forward, I see no reason why this archive cannot collaborate with other archives, not just in India but globally. Because for us, the singular purpose is to make sure that teachers, teacher educators and scholars, the process of searching for material is the pain of that is reduced. What they do with it is of course left to their individual expertise. Professor Varadarajan, since we're having this conversation and you've been an integral part of our team, would you like to discuss and maybe show us some samples of the wide variety of resources we have in our collection as on date?
I think there is enormous variety, not just in what we call textbooks, but also the different kinds of things that sort of come along with it, and they in fact add much to the way we understand this long story about textbooks or the longer history of teaching learning material in the subcontinent. And it's also important to take note of the fact that a lot of what we often say about teaching learning material in India also has some relationship with how school books are produced elsewhere, because many of them were brought into India, abridged or they became the model. So there is enormous variety to speak about. Now let me begin by giving you a list of materials, different kinds of materials that we have, and then I will go on to talk about some variety, different types within each of this. Now the very term textbook in India begins to be used only in the late 19th century. For a very long time the term textbook does not appear in the literature and education. Of course, people are talking about the need to introduce books for use in schools, but they often do not necessarily refer to them as textbooks. So the term textbooks, as we talk about them, a class of books today, itself has undergone enormous evolution or stages of development over that. So this archive it would give us a sense of the different important milestones or such to illustrate how we have gotten to the point that we here, and what has it been like in the past 2 centuries. So that's one thing. And second, when we're talking about textbooks, we are also talking about readers, of various kinds. They are not necessarily just language readers. For a very long time, a reader that was used in schools covered topics in sciences, or things not necessarily related to languages per se, but this is one book that would be used for a variety of to introduce students to a variety of subjects or topics. Now, as far as these textbooks are concerned, there is some variety that we must necessarily pay attention to. One is the range in terms of that has resulted because of the time period that we are talking about. We have books right from 1820s and we have books published very recently. So we are talking about a history of 200 years, and that itself gives rise to enormous variety. 2 is the question of language. There are dozens of languages, and in the post-independence period, we have in fact produced in many more languages than we saw them being produced before that. And within languages, there are bilingual books. Okay, there are a good number of school books which are bilingual in nature. And when I say bilingual, one of the things that there are very interesting books where you may have, say, a book which is bilingual, Hindustani and English, where Hindustani is written using Roman characters. All right. So we have books in Bangla which also have substantial portions in English, but Bangla is written using Roman characters. So the term bilingual also now needs to take into account, what was the script being used. And we also know that over a period of time, orthography, the emergence of a script and so on, has had a very close relationship with the production of school books. So, the story of language is also tied to story of scripts, orthography, printing, all of that. The second is the third point that I should mention is the range of textbooks that we are talking about, the range of subjects that we are talking about. It's not just physics, the way we understand school subjects today. That is because the very idea of what constitutes school subjects, that has also undergone an enormous amount of change. Right? So we see books on health, we see books on environment, what we call general knowledge, physical education. All of these books, all of these subjects are, you would find examples of all of these subjects in the archive. The other point that we must take notice of is, we often today when we talk about textbooks, we know that government agencies, have a very strong presence in this. But this is a very recent phenomenon, probably something that you can trace back to the 60s or a little before that. So which would mean that we are talking only about private publishers. That needn't be. So we are talking about, of course, there were commercial publishers like Cooper Sons, Charles Sarao, and Macmillan, all of these publishers. But we are also talking about publishing houses that were managed by learned societies or vernacular literature societies, missions, mission presses and so on. So we are talking about textbook in the archive. We have textbooks that were published by government organizations, commercial publishers, these learned societies, associations of teachers. So we have a book which is in fact published for school, teachers in primary schools, but by a collective of mathematics teachers. So we have such books. Then we have because in the past, textbooks were not necessarily produced only by government agencies or private agencies, and that schools had a certain kind of an autonomy, or provincial bodies had a certain kind of an autonomy to recommend books to be used in schools. There were individuals who were writing books and publishing them on their own. So we have, books published by individuals, not necessarily by one of these presses. And then, closer to our own period, there are non-governmental organizations, teachers forums, and so on and so forth. So, we have, when we are talking about textbooks, the diversity needs to be understood along all of these, distinct points of reference. Now, what do we have apart from these textbooks? That is also a fairly long list. One is that, there is, of course, a large number of books of reference, dictionaries for use in schools. Then, we have atlases, workbooks, and so on and so forth. So we have a range of these books. We also have, it is very difficult to call them guides as we would use them today, but there was supplementary material that were produced by one of these publishers that helped you enhance, your understanding of terms that were used. So there were glossaries that were produced for school use in schools. So we have a few, and they also have a bilingual character, many of them. Then we have, what may be today, it is easy to use the term draft of school books, right? Now, because draft in the sense that, what were the stages that a textbook went through before it was eventually established. Now we know that, that of course would qualify as an instance of a draft. But we also know of, even today, different government bodies, publishing a version of the book which would be piloted in a small number of schools, and then based on the feedback of teachers, students, a further set of improvements or editing would happen before they were to be published. So we have some of that. But we also have, publishers who, because, it was left to the provincial committees or schools to decide what books were to be used, individuals who publish books and said, look, why won't you consider this? Okay, so the idea of a draft is not the manuscript form of things or a related form, but all of these as well. So we have draft copies. But along with these books of reference, books of workbooks and school books, just textbooks, we also have a lot of material that were published for teachers. How to use these textbooks, how to teach these subjects, and so on. So our archive has a good variety, a good range of books of this kind. Then, of course, there are committee reports, and committee reports for a time when books were not necessarily produced by government bodies, but the colonial government, and even after 1947, for the first 15 years or so, governments pretty much confined their activities to selection of books from the wide variety that were available. So processes that were to be adhered to in selecting. There were also reviews of textbooks that periodically took place. So we have such committee reports, and many of these discussions related to textbooks went all the way up to the Central Advisory Board of Education, which was set up in the 1930s. So we have those reports and so on. And and since then we have had any number of textbook-related committees to look into different aspects of textbook production, commercial aspects, and so on and so forth. So we have a good number of those as well. Then we have, so textbooks of today are, in most cases, are easily relatable to the developments in curricula, right? So we have a large number of curriculum documents, curriculum framework documents, and so on and so forth. We also have reviews of textbooks, something that we don't see, but for a long period of time, textbooks were reviewed. Magazines devoted entirely to school education or higher education carried a large number of reviews, as we call book reviews today, in journals and so on. So we have samples of that. Books were advertised. So we have some very interesting advertisements And the another category that we have in the archive is, text, discussions, debates have always been there when it comes to textbooks, but there have also been very important litigations about textbooks, and they in fact go back to 1890s. So we have some of those material, and so we have all of this, but we hope that so these are all documents, and within each of them a fair amount of internal variety. But I think that as we go further, we would also have older issues, or the entire run of magazines or journals that played a very crucial role for teacher formation, their professional lives, right from the 1890s. So we hope that the archive would extend to include such. We do not have them at the moment, but we should definitely be going in that direction. And another set of documents that we hope we have, we are trying to see how these could be accessed, is to look at a historical collection of lesson plans in relation to teacher education programs, and how some of these lessons plans may have been preserved in much older institutions of education.
Now that we've kind of looked at the different kinds of resources we have in the collection, who do you think would find the Schoolbooks Archive useful?
So the term archives appears very prominently in the very title of the project, but this should not give rise to an impression that it's only for those who want to look at the past of this. Of course, there is a lot that would help a historian or a sociologist or someone who's studying different historical aspects of the development of school education in India in relation to many other segments of education, for instance teacher education or all of that. So for those who are interested in exploring those aspects, of course there is a lot. These materials can give a sense of the sense of what is it to understand the development of a genre. What has it been like what has the science curriculum been like over, say, a century or more? What has illustrations been like over the same period? How have topics related to gender? So all of the topics related to gender, have been discussed and found prominent presence, or if at all they have found a presence in these discussions. So there is of course that part. Now it also tells us quite a bit about, or by way of implication, pedagogy, assessment practices, and all that. So there is a lot for a historian or those who are interested in historical aspects of school education to learn from such an archive. At the same time, I would think that there is a lot for those who are in fact working towards developing textbooks or school books for the coming years. This is not to say that these, the term textbooks as we understand today should remain stable and this is the only way we should be writing. In fact, what the archive does is to provide, a wide spectrum of alternatives to imagine what other possibilities could be explored in order to make school books or teaching learning materials available, because that is exactly the kind of spectrum that we see in the past, and over a period of time we seem to have come to identify textbooks with a certain form as we see them today. So this spectrum from the range of alternatives in the past in fact can be a repertoire of ideas about what could things be like for future. At least you can improve upon, or you can think of alternatives that have hitherto not been explored. And that means there is a lot for textbook developers, textbook writers, those who are doing illustrations for textbooks, curriculum developers. So that's the other part. I think there is a lot for a teacher. One, again, this different ways in which topics or themes and curricula have been treated in a variety of bodies. So you do, if you're looking for alternatives or different ways in which content could be transacted in classes, I think the textbook allows for this kind of a range. Similarly for assessments, the different kind of activities that students could be introduced to, and the different ways in which experiments could be set up and all that. Different ranges of literature, literary pieces that students could be introduced to, different illustrations that have been used. So what it does is, for the curricular developer, for the textbook writer, for illustrators, for teachers, what you have is a variety being made available. So who would find this archive useful?
One is obviously academics, by which I mean researchers, whether that's faculty or students or research scholars, who are engaged with the broad topic of the history of education. Currently, definitely in India over the last 200 years, as we build our collection, South Asia, globally, all of that, So the impact of culture on understanding of school education, for instance, would become, even within the country with our current collection, possible, and definitely once we make it an fully international collection, those possibilities would go up. So those who want to study the evolution of education in India, those who actually produce these teaching learning materials are school books, editors, publishers, illustrators, content writers, and most importantly transactors of these in the classroom, so people that use these in various ways. So at one level it's the creation of the resource. The second is, as we all know, if all we had to do was create it and make it available to a student, you wouldn't need a mediator, right? So different teachers use it in different ways, the same resource, and so therefore they also would find it useful to come into the site and look for how other teachers have possibly engaged with the same material, but possibly also, given the breadth of our country, teachers that have access only to the textbooks and learning resources available in the state schools in that region now would have access to other such resources being used across the country and outside. So that itself is, increases the span of scholarship to their teaching. The third set of people, often not spoken of, but as you rightly said, the evolution of script, right? From the gurukulas of yesterday and oral histories and oral ways of imparting education to the move to the written, it's not a it's a deep and lasting change that has happened. And how did that change get affected? What got left out? Most importantly, even after we have moved to written materials as the carriers of knowledge, the changes in script, and so that the whole history of languages, the politics of language, all of that gets a fillip with actual resources that can be used to answer those questions. The role of textbooks itself, even within the larger family of school books or school related materials and artifacts, what role does a textbook play? I mean, very often in contemporary India we find that textbooks sometimes are seen as imprisonment of the mind of both the teacher and the student to the curriculum, and exams is conceived at the last mile of delivery, which is not what they are meant for, right? And so I think it would be nice if people would open up a discussion within the collection using illustrations of how this is a narrowing down of the potential use of textbooks. In the contemporary world, examinations have become, the way to assess learning. And so I think this collection, with its collection of not only question banks and question papers, but more importantly curriculum documents, assessment frameworks, curriculum frameworks, would open up, I hope, a rich discussion about what exactly are you assessing, what should you assess, what can't you assess through written modes and other modes. So many of these things come to my mind looking at a current collection. As we add to it, I'm sure, and as researchers themselves engage, there would be, the creativity of the teacher, educator, researcher, scholar would open up avenues that even I cannot think of at this moment. So Professor Varadarajan, you have been a key faculty member of the university who's been engaged with the Schoolbooks Archive right from the time of conceptualization to our current state of execution. Would you like to share with us some of the challenges that you faced on this journey?
I'd like to classify these challenges into two categories. One is the set of challenges related to how little we know and how do we get to know better about these range of books itself. I'll come to that. That's one. The second is, even if once we get to know, all of these, once we get to know what are the different kinds of books that have been published, made available for school use, how do we access them? Now we are talking about 200 years of public education, and pretty much for this entire period, school books have been in production of one kind or the other. Now, it is very difficult to, even though we have printed catalogs and now book historians are trying to compile short title and long title catalogs for almost every book that's been published in each of these languages. I think that is happening for some languages, but not for every languages as yet. So there is a fair amount of work to be done in a range of languages, regions, and so on. So even when we go around trying to collect books, we still do not know what is it that we are looking for, or what were the kind of books that were produced and so on. So there is a certain kind of a lack of information on what are the things that were produced in all these periods during this. Okay, so that's one thing. The second is, even when we get to know that these were the books that were produced, that's the second challenge all about. That book historians tend to talk about a term called ephemera. Print materials that have been produced, but they are in use only for a very short period of time. And textbooks, for some reason, seem to be is in fact like that. And if you actually look at it, we know that every 5 years or every 10 years, a new batch of books are introduced. Some books have remained in the same have remained in use for a very long period of time. Sometimes the book undergoes revision and so on. But what happens is, every time there is something new, there is a new batch of books introduced, there is a tendency to discard some of the older material, and that happens in large numbers. Different kinds of institutions do that. Schools tend to do that, teacher education institutions do that, and public libraries do not always seek work towards keeping large collections of libraries. So these books sort of disappear from the scene. Now, so we have to, and if you actually think that there is one institution where we can go and look at, collect, access these books and see what could be done about them, well, we don't always find such institutions or repositories or libraries. I'm not saying that there aren't exceptions, there are. So what happens then is that you have to go to a range of institutions and see what they have, put together a collection then. Even then, you can't be very sure that, suppose you're talking about, say, Marathi, an example that we discussed a little earlier, it's unlikely that, or one can't be very sure that we would come back home, having all 10 volumes of the readers from grade 1 to 2. So there is, the completeness, comprehensiveness, all of that, you might turn lucky, but then sometimes you are waiting for, or you're struggling with finding out, one volume somehow goes missing. That is important because, if you're looking at a curriculum, there is this idea of curricular progression, sequencing of topics, so you don't know what has happened in between. So that is, so one challenge is that, we know what we are looking for, but we don't know where to find them. And, the organizations or institutions trying to discard. Another aspect to this challenge that many of these books, even when they are found in libraries, they are not necessarily included in the catalog. They may be in the storeroom or in the attic or one such warehouse. And we have been to libraries where there are interesting collections of books, but they have not been attended to for decades, 40 years, 50 years, and they are in a very bad state. And many of them could not be recovered even even if you are willing to use very sophisticated techniques of preservation and so on. So that's another challenge that we see. A fourth thing that I should mention is that we know books, we know they're not there. What about publishers? And some of the most important publishers who have played a very decisive role in the development of text, they have not there anymore, and we do not know where their archives are. All right. So there are many different kinds of challenges. There are any number of organizations. There are any number of non-governmental organizations that have produced very interesting material, but they're not. They have sort of ceased to exist. And how do we go about them? So one is information. Two, when we have information, where do we go and where do we go looking for them? And that I would think that even if they're there, I think for a very long time we would find ourselves spending enormous amount of time locating where these collections are. And even when we find such libraries, spending time identifying books in their personal collection, in their individual collections, preparing a list and cataloging them and see how they are relevant to our school books and so on. So I think these are some of the challenges, which is exciting in a way, because every time you go to an institution, you always come back having discovered 10 things that you knew nothing about. So Rashmi, you mentioned that this is an archive to which we will keep adding material for many years to come. This is going to be a long process, and for many years it will continue to remain a work in progress. But so that's definitely something that you would consider as future, an important part of the archive in the way the collection is enriched and so on. Are there other plans for the archive that you've been thinking about and you would like to speak a little bit about?
Collection building for the archives is a continuing work in progress, and both in terms of the depth of our collection as well as the geographical spread of our collection and the breadth of the types of documents that we can actually build, incorporate into the archives. That challenge that is a way forward, and that would take a significant amount of time from the knowledge management team at Azim Premji Foundation, as well as all our colleagues across the foundation and the university that are working with us on this. While that will continue, we would also want to parallelly start organizing workshops and offering fellowships to two broad categories of scholars that in a sense could work with the purpose of this archives, but also even in a broader sense, the world of knowledge and archiving. So workshops, our School of Education already has a calendar of continuing education programs where multiple aspects of school education are discussed, and wherever possible, where we feel that the already rich discussions that happen both in those workshops and with the articles and academic papers engaged with, if they can be sort of also landed in a certain sense with an empirical use of actual learning resources that contribute to those debates, then that would be something for the Schoolbooks Archive to really actively work towards identifying where in the curriculum can school books and this collection be leveraged to add more empirical content to the theoretical debates around education. So that's one. We would also want to organize specific workshops that would continue this conceptualization process for the Schoolbooks Archives. The one that we did in 2016 deserves a repetition in 2021, and so that is this continuous search for innovations and ideas about what else needs to be done should continue. We understand that a lot of young scholars with interesting ideas might need fellowship support, and so we would as a team want to encourage research proposals or from young scholars, and think of offering temporary fellowships where they can engage not just digitally but also physically with the university library, with all of Azim Premji Foundation field libraries, and possibly also our partner libraries across India, depending on their topic and what requires to be done. The other very important thing I think we should start planning for is actually host curriculum and textbook writing workshops. Not just see the school books as a finished product and then discuss it, but be involved in the ideas that are discussed before generating these learning resources. So curriculum and textbook writing workshops, I think, is a different category of discussions that we need to start actively planning for. Finally, I think the way the current archives is, we are keenly aware that we might want to innovate on technological innovations that would allow some groups that are habitually left out and become invisible. For instance, how would a visually challenged scholar or a teacher educator engage with our archives? In today's day and time, there's not only a need to think about this extension, but the solutions are also in place. So that's another area that we would want to explore in future.
So Subbu is the one who worked on textbook archive, school textbook archive along with Varda. So we'd asked Subbu to prepare a note on this entire enterprise and the rationale, the thoughts behind this initiative. So I would just read out the note that Subbu prepared in this context. Eklavya has continued the work of Kishore Bharti, Friends Rural Center, etc., which created the Hoshangabad Science Teaching Program, which was one of the earliest attempts at replacing textbooks, at least in science teaching. The instruction material initially, in the form of cards, merely gave directions for performing experiments in classroom by children themselves. The data thus generated was to be discussed in the class to arrive at some conclusions. This was the pedagogy of guided discovery, in which the teacher and the print materials were to be facilitators rather than fountainheads of knowledge. Then, Eklavya went on to experiment with diverse forms of printed materials to support the learning of children, some closer to the conventional textbooks and mostly interactive texts. These include workbooks, exemplary materials for teachers to improvise upon, readers, magazines, posters, activity cards, and many other forms. In the process, Eklavya created two kinds of archives. Firstly, a very rich archive of the process of creation of innovative programs like the HSTP, Primary Education Program, and the Social Science Programs. These include background documents, lively correspondence between different actors, drafts of materials, comments on them, reports of extensive debates around them, and also samples of children's and teachers' writings, different versions of the books, etc. These have been, to a very limited extent, used to produce some useful monographs on the evolution of the programs, but a fresh researcher with new questions will strike a gold mine of source material in them. These are mostly classified, and a rough catalogue of the items is available at Hoshangabad in the archival section. The second kind of archive relates to diverse kinds of textbooks in use in different points of time in different states and by the NCERT and private publishers. Eklavya has been involved in different capacities in the development of school textbooks across the country, especially in states like MP, Rajasthan, Gujarat, Chhattisgarh, Jammu Kashmir, Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra, and Kerala, and probably a few more as well, besides indirect participation in several other states. They span a long period from 1990 onward. Thus, Eklavya has built a rich collection of textbooks then in use, the drafts of new textbooks, early versions of these books, etc., and also correspondence around them. In addition to these, Eklavya also has a modest international collection of textbooks in use in different English-speaking countries. Now we come to the Schoolbooks Archive and the educational research possible around it. Education in India, especially its pedagogic aspects, have been crucially hinged upon the textbooks, which have determined not just what information is taught to children in which order, but also the classroom processes and student evaluation. In fact, till very recently, curriculum framework and syllabus documents were rarely available, and these were known only through their embodied form, the textbooks. Thus, any study of pedagogy and changes in it in different states will need to interrogate these textbooks and other materials in use in schools. Textbooks are physical entities which need to be examined in their corporeality. The paper, its texture, weight, the print, the colors, the binding, everything are as much a part of the textbook reality as the content of the chapters. Handling a book printed by Thomson Press as early as HSTB books were, and one from the Textbook Corporation Press as the later Eklavya textbooks could have been a very, very different experience. While many of these things as color, design and printing quality can be understood from the electronic copies available on the internet, many other dimensions of textbooks like paper, texture require physical handling of the books. Thus, a repository of the physical books is as important as a virtual repository. The experience of the textbooks is not just confined to the content, but the overall effect of the design, printing and paper quality. Research into textbooks also need to go into issues related to these, and physical repositories of textbooks, etc., are important in this respect. The term schoolbook covers a large area, going much beyond textbooks to include all print materials made available to children: workbooks, atlases, globes, posters, wall maps, readers, library books, books given away as prizes, children's magazines, and also examination question papers, besides many others. It also includes teacher instruction materials, teacher guides as well, which were to help teachers design their classroom work. Looking into them in their totality tells us about the larger print context within which schooling takes place. Needless to point out, an archive like a museum removes an object from its actual context, and we will never know the kind of combination of different kinds of materials in actual classroom practices and how the teachers and students experience them. But they do tell us much about the possibilities within which teaching learning took place. An archive is not merely a site of historical research into bygone days, but also a repository of ideas and materials that can be drawn upon the contemporary use. And as such, textbook writers, writers for children, publishers of children's books have a mine of resource to draw for their own work. And now we move into Eklavya and the School Book Archive program, the specific initiative that is being taken upon. Eklavya was one of the organizations that mooted the idea of creating a virtual and physical archive of India's educational history, housed in several locations, but accessible to scholars and education workers for purposes of study. Eklavya's own modest collection of such materials from the 1970s inspired this effort, but at the same time, the deteriorating conditions of libraries in old teacher education institutions and schools warned us about the potential loss of much valuable material across the country. It was suggested, therefore, that these collections should be scanned for relevant materials so that at least they can be preserved electronically, and if institutions are willing to collaborate, create a chain of sites for the archive to ensure the physical protection of the materials. One major impediment in our educational material development is the very short institutional memory about past work. A look into an archive of this kind will be very instructive to educationists to understand the diverse experiments done in the past and draw upon them. The existence of well-preserved and serviced archives can help us design courses of study for material developers and publishers to introduce greater professionalism in the field.